You've probably heard to plant your tomatoes next to your basil so that it improves the flavor. And I'm going to tell you exactly why that advice and other companion planting charts honestly just don't work and aren't even true. And we're going to talk about exactly what does work and what rules to follow.
If you want to break free from the industrial food system and make a real impact by growing your own regenerative garden, join the free radical gardening community on School. It's a safe place for like-minded growers, hundreds of members sharing, learning, and connecting. Inside, you'll also find a classroom, a members map with people all over the world, and a calendar of events. There's no algorithm, there's no ads, just a regenerative gardening community supporting each other exactly how social media should be. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description. I'll see you in the community.
Polyculture and companion planting. So the goal here is to understand why we plant in polyculture, why diversity is so key, and we're going to understand and myth bust some of the differences between companion planting and diversity in polyculture and what actually works in a practical framework for you to design and take this right into action, creating your planting into your beds year to year. You've probably heard that you should plant your basil next to your tomatoes, or that you should plant marigolds all over your garden to repel pests. And some of this is genuinely useful, and a lot of it is just information that's been repeated and hasn't necessarily been proven. So we're going to talk about what actually works, diversity strategies that you can follow, and experiments that you can start taking into your garden. So really this principle is what takes your garden from a collection of a couple crops or rows of crops to actually something that resembles an ecosystem. You're going to be able to understand the bigger picture of why nature grows polycultures like a forest, and then we're going to take that into the practical action. So let's start with addressing the companion planting question. So the research on specific companion plants like tomatoes and basil and marigolds around your garden and carrots and onions planted together, a lot of that research is mixed at best, and the results are just honestly an oversimplification that haven't necessarily been proven to actually work. And people grow some things together, they pair it, and then they say that they're helping each other and companioning. Honestly, we're going to dispel most of the idea of companion planting at all, and I'll share with you what is for sure proven to definitely work in your garden. Some things that are actually supported is trap cropping. This is the idea of planting some specific crops that are going to attract pests away from your main crop. Like an example would be like nasturtiums attract aphids like magnets. Plant your nasturtiums near your brassicas. The nasturtiums all get covered in aphids. You pull those out, you spray those off, and your brassicas are protected. There's also ways of doing this, of planting different areas of squash for squash bugs, or trapping specific crops and noticing what really attracts specific insects and then using that as a trap crop. This is something that definitely works in the garden, and I would highly recommend experimenting with. Nitrogen fixation is also a method that is definitely worth utilizing in your garden space. So like specific crops like legumes, so beans for example, fix atmospheric nitrogen and bring that down into the soil. And so planting beans next to heavy feeders like corn or tomatoes is going to take that nitrogen and bring it down into the soil, improving soil health. So this is something we definitely want to practice in the garden. Aromatic confusion, so planting really strong smelling herbs like rosemary and marigolds actually does confuse some pests and other critters. So you can plant borders and edges of flowering herbs and plants, and that is definitely an effective strategy to avoid off pests. It's one strategy, it's not like an all-encompassing solution, but it can help. What's mostly folklore is like basil improves tomato flavor. Things like that you can kind of just toss out, and let's explore polyculture and the bigger idea around that. Companion planting is about specific pairings, and polyculture is about designing the whole system with diversity as the foundation. In nature, monocultures don't exist. A forest isn't a field of identical trees. A meadow isn't all just one species of grass. Diversity is how natural systems build resilience. When one species struggle, others fill the gaps. Pests that specialize in specific crops can't devastate a diverse system the way that they can devastate a monoculture system. So a garden is most resilient when it includes multiple crop families growing together, flowering plants interspersed throughout, crops at different heights and structures and layers, something always in flower to attract beneficial insects. So this isn't complicated to implement. It's mostly just not doing the opposite, which is planting an entire area, an entire garden in one crop, not having any beds with flowers, and not designing a garden that's all food and no habitat. A major benefit to this is that it's absolutely beautiful. So let's talk about specifically what diversity actually does. Number one is that it reduces the pest pressure. So the cabbage white butterfly or the Colorado potato beetle has a wide open field of anything to eat on. Having a diversity of crops makes the crops actually harder for the pests to find. In diverse plantings, host crops are interspersed with other species, and the populations of those pests build slowly because they have to work harder for it. This doesn't eliminate pest pressure, but it reduces it and slows it down, which is a realistic goal. Also, diversity supports beneficial insects. So the ladybugs and the lacewings and the hoverflies and the parasitic wasps all eat pests that damage your crops. So they need two things from your garden. That's prey to eat and flowers to feed on as adults. It's an ecosystem. Flowers that are really particularly valuable and easy to grow here that you can also eat and use as medicine are calendula, borage, nasturtium, phacelia, dill, fennel, sweet alyssum, and native wildflowers. These are going to attract a wide range of beneficial insects throughout the whole season. Also, having diversity in your garden is going to improve pollination. So all your fruiting crops like tomatoes and cucumbers and squash and melons need pollination to set fruit. So a garden with diverse flowering plants is going to have more pollinators coming in and pollinating your crops more consistently, which then ends up creating higher yields. And another really fun one is having diverse crops builds healthy soil. Yep. So actually having a diverse polyculture of crops in your garden is going to build soil diversity. That's because different plants have different relationships with soil biology. The plant root exudates are feeding microbes in the soil, and each specific plant has specific microbes that it feeds. So having a diverse array of plants feeding different microbes means you have a healthier soil biology and more diversity in your soil. A diverse planting builds a more complex soil food web. A monoculture favors a very narrow range of soil organisms that can deplete specific nutrients while leaving others untouched. So this might seem a little bit abstract, but let's get into how you can specifically design a polyculture bed in your garden. Increasing diversity, increasing polyculture in your garden is usually going to just improve yields and have no net negative impact on the yields of your garden. It will only increase the life and the beauty of your space. And the goal here in terms of the visual aspect of polyculture is contrast. So you have different heights and colors and textures. It really makes the garden beautiful and pop. It creates beauty and resilience and diversity that makes your garden function even better. So let's walk through this polyculture bed to give you a hands-on example of what this could look like. You're gonna have multiple layers in your polyculture bed, and you can think of it as like tall, medium, and ground cover or low layers. Starting with the tall layers, these are gonna be tall, impactful crops. Often you'll have these on a trellis, but not always. In this bed specifically, this is tomatoes. So our tomatoes are gonna grow up nice and tall on this trellis here, right? So that's creating structure. Some other things that are gonna grow tall here is the amaranth, okra, corn. These tall growing plants are gonna be your height layer. So you're gonna be growing those nice and tall and upright. Then you have your mid layer. We have beans here. This is a mid-layer crop that is gonna grow about this high. They're gonna grow and also fix nitrogen underneath these heavy feeding tomatoes. We also have kale, that's a mid-level crop. We have peppers here as a mid-level crop. So we have multiple layers, and then we're gonna get lower into the ground level. So that's like nasturtium, lettuce, and chamomile. And these zinnias are gonna be a little bit taller here. Those are gonna complement the tomatoes. So we're thinking in these layers of how these are gonna grow together. And over here, I have some zucchini. We have the beans on the edge with our zucchini. That's gonna be a tall layer because I'm gonna trellis these up taller on a pole. And these okras are gonna get really tall here. And then essentially in this whole bed, I'm weaving flowers throughout the entire thing. So I have coxcomb, we have amaranth, a couple different kinds of amaranth, we have nasturtiums, we have zinnias. We're weaving flowers and diversity through this entire thing. As I trellis up these squash and okra, there's gonna be room for plants underneath these as they grow up higher. So quickly, let's just walk through all the plants that are in this bed right now. We have celosia or coxcomb, we have okra, beans, yacone, zucchini, amaranth, two different kinds. We have tomatoes, we have peppers, we have beans, we have kale, nasturtiums, zinnias, lettuce, and chamomile. That's like 12 different crops just in this one bed. This bed is another really good example of polyculture. So this side is facing south, right? So the sun is coming up. This is the north side of the bed. We're gonna have a big wall trellis of cucumbers. So in front of that, we'll have layers. So this is kind of like a triangle coming down. We're gonna have the cucumbers up higher, then we'll have another layer of crops here, and then we'll have another layer of crops here. And why we're orienting it that way is because this is the sunniest side, the south facing side. So we're essentially orienting this down at an angle at moving up so everything gets a good amount of sunlight. So I have the cucumbers growing up this side, and we have ginger and turmeric and zucchini that's gonna grow up a little bit higher. And then I have this whole edge here that I'm gonna be able to plant out with a lower growing crop like lettuce or some other lower growing crop that I can plant. And something I always do on the end caps, I always do something different and interesting on the end because it creates a really beautiful aesthetic and function. So I have some nasturtiums here. I have hibiscus and Tulsi basil. That's flowering medicinal herbs and stuff on the edge. Some rows of turnip planted here, and then the ginger and turmeric. So wherever I have a wall, like on the edge of this greenhouse, I like to do something beautiful, flowering. It kind of softens this edge. These are cosmos that are gonna grow up nice and tall. We have sunflowers, and then underneath here, we got basil. We got onions underneath these sunflowers. Here's another really good example of a polyculture bed. So we have the carrot and onion rows. This is a classic polyculture combination that I love to do. It's okay to follow some companion planting advice if it gives you some inspiration, right? So I have rows of onions and carrots intermixed. There's some just random volunteer amaranth that's coming up in here. Then we have rows of beets. These are just tons of beets all up in here. And then we have our pole bean trellis. So we have our pole beans that are growing up these. This is gonna get nice and tall, provide a lot of structure. And then on the end here, we have some flowers, I have some calendula, and we have a pea trellis off the side. Here's another polyculture bed idea. So we have some different stuff at the end. We got kale and lettuce and nasturtium. And then I have staggered rows of all of my cabbage, and onions are planted in between the cabbage on both sides. So we have the edge is all onions, and then we have our cabbage, and then we have onions in between. And what I'll actually do here is as the cabbage gets bigger, I'll remove the bottom leaves here so that it gives the onion a lot of space and sunlight to grow. I already harvested the Chinese cabbage here, so there's a big gap that filled up. So I sowed a quick crop of radishes just right up in there. Then we have more cabbage at the end. And sometimes I'll still sow like big blocks of stuff. I have big blocks of broccoli here. So I have like a big block of broccoli that I planted, and I have some onions here in between that. And then I have another big block of broccoli. And the reason that I planted these big blocks of broccoli together is because I actually have to cover these broccoli plants to keep off the cabbage moth. So because I'm having to cover all the broccoli plants, it makes the most sense to plant them all together because I'm managing them the same way. So that's another consideration. These all had to have hoops and row cover. So if I had broccoli scattered all over the garden, it would be impossible for me to manage the pests on those. So those are all practical combinations that already worked for me, and I'll give you some more. So there's the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash. I grow this every year. The corn provides trellis for the beans. You plant that, you wait a month, you plant the beans, they're gonna grow up. As the corn gets taller, the beans are gonna fix nitrogen into the soil. Squash covers the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. And it's a ancient functional polyculture where each plant does something for the other. It needs space and is best for just like a big, large area, not necessarily in smaller garden beds. But this is an example of a polyculture that people have been growing for a very, very long time. The brassica bed with nasturtiums is a great example. The kale, broccoli, cabbage, and nasturtiums woven throughout. They act as a trap crop for aphids and caterpillars go for them, and then those leave your brassicas a little bit cleaner. You can pull or spray the nasturtiums when they're colonized and then let new ones fill back in. Then there's the salad bed medley. So like this is a very beginner friendly polyculture. You can mix lettuce and arugula and spinach and chard and radish and oriental greens and bok choy and spring onions all together and with edible flowers like nasturtium and borage and calendula, and then harvest the leaves across the whole bed, right? So this is a really beautiful, ecologically diverse, endlessly productive bed that you can just keep succession planting. The obvious like tomato, basil, marigold bed. So marigolds are generally useful here. They suppress root rot nematodes and confuse pests, and the basil is in the bed because you want it in your kitchen, right? Like this is just awesome. It's like the themed beds, right? This is a really fun way to approach polyculture. So you can design a whole bed around a theme, and this is simplifying decision making for you and producing something visually unified. So this is like the pizza bed, right? You can grow tomatoes, basil, oregano, parsley, garlic, peppers, whatever you want to put on your pizza. The salad bowl bed with all your greens. You can have just a pollinator bed. So sunflowers and borage and calendula and phacelia and echinacea. You can have the brassica medley. So you can do like all the brassica greens like kale, cabbage, broccoli, chard, nasturtiums with dill or fennel for some height, and maybe like a weird and wonderful bed. So this is a bed for experimenting with anything unusual you want to try, like okra or amaranth or tomatillos or unusual varieties. And theme beds are easier to plan. They're easier to explain to others, right? This makes sense to people. And often they're more productive because everything in the bed has a similar water and feeding needs. So now let's talk about how to fill gaps. Gaps appear constantly in a polyculture bed because all these different plants are harvesting and finishing at different times. So if a plant finishes or a seedling fails, a succession sowing could be delayed. And here's some practical techniques for filling them intelligently. So oversowing is a technique that I use every single year. And essentially every year I'll grow more seedlings than I actually need. And this is a strength rather than a weakness because I'll have backups. If anything fails, anything that's left over can increase polyculture in the garden. So there's always more space to fill and gaps to plug. So you can get creative in trying to find them and just plugging those gaps with oversowing seedlings that you have. Interplanting is a really key technique here that I'm always doing. And so that's using space and time between crops efficiently. So an example of this is like tall and short crops can share the same bed when their height differences mean that they're not competing for light or resources. A classic example of this is like a trellis of climbing beans or cucumbers on the north side of a bed and lettuce and spinach growing in front of it. And the taller crop doesn't shade the shorter ones. Another way of interplanting is having fast crops sown between slow crops to use the space that the slow crop takes to establish. So that's like radishes in between carrots. The radishes are ready in 25 days. By the time the carrots are filling in and need the space, they're harvested, right? And the lettuce between young tomato transplants is another great example. The lettuce is harvested before the tomatoes even shaded out and are producing. So the key principle here is to never let the ground sit empty. If there's bare soil and enough weeks left in the season, something can grow there. Corner planting or edge planting, every bed on the edge gets a nasturtium, a calendula, a borage. These corners are often wasted space, and flowers will look deliberate and attract beneficials into the bed. Underplanting is another one that I'll always use, and that's planting low ground cover beneath tall crops as they mature. So that's like kale seedlings under a tomato canopy, spinach under trellis cucumbers. Use the vertical layers so one bed does double duty. We already covered diagonal planting in the plant spacing section, but this is instead of using straight rows, plant in diagonal lines across the bed. It creates more of a natural look and improves airflow between plants and just really maximizes your bed space. And then there's always patching, right? So when a gap appears mid-season, direct sow a fast crop immediately rather than leaving bare soil and there's arugula and radish and spinach and already in 30 to 40 days, and that gap becomes a productive patch. So really start this simple, right? You do not need an elaborate polyculture system from the start. Two habits are going to get you the most benefit immediately. One, always include flowers. Every bed, every season, start with nasturtiums. They're foolproof and genuinely useful. You can eat the flowers. They're amazing for pollinators. Add calendula. It's a really good medicinal herb to get familiar with. Let a few herbs flower rather than cutting them back constantly, and that alone moves your garden meaningfully away from monoculture. And then another easy thing to do is break up large blocks. Like instead of 8 lettuce plants in a row, grow 4 lettuce and then 4 spinach and then alternate them. So instead of like my whole brassica bed, you can mix in some chard and a row of flowers. Some spatial changes there, but like big ecological and visual differences. And you have the freedom to choose between regular and irregular planting patterns, straight lines, or more natural like scattered arrangements. Both work. The irregular approach tends to look more beautiful and is often considered more resilient, right? And the regular approach is easier to manage and plan for when you're starting out. So you can start there, start with whatever feels comfortable and evolve it from there. And I can't talk about polyculture without talking about these edible perennial borders around the entire perimeter of my garden. So this mulched edge around the entire perimeter of my garden is serving multiple functions. You always need to think about and incorporate perennials. Perennials in the garden produce year after year. You don't have to manage them, but yes, they are going to come back. So we do want to dedicate most of our garden bed space to annuals, but it's nice to incorporate perennials. You could have like an end cap of rosemary or thyme or sage, and then that's always coming back, and then the rest you have is annuals. Or you could have an entire asparagus bed. For me, I like to put most of my perennials on the edges of my garden, and this does multiple things. It creates a barrier that's mulched and full of plants, so this reduces weed pressure, because the edges of your garden are where all these grasses and weeds are going to want to come into your garden beds. So I stop that by having this mulched perennial edible border, so it stops weed encroachment. And then when I have my fence line up here, this whole fence line is going to be kind of a wall, and what it does is it softens the edge of the wall and creates a really functional, beautiful, edible border space. So we have German chamomile, comfrey, oregano, sage, strawberries, Egyptian walking onions. There's some nettle in here interplanted with some zinnias. We put some annual flowers on this edge too. We got more strawberries along this whole edge. And then we have flowers. We have sunflowers planted and taro planted up on this edge behind the compost bin. Over here I have more comfrey. We have thyme, oregano, more Egyptian walking onions. We have Jerusalem artichokes that we actually really want to pull out of here. More annual flowers, bee balm, irises, more strawberries along this edge, more Egyptian walking onions. And the opportunities for planting on this edge are endless. You could do currants, blueberries, gooseberries. You could do echinacea, black-eyed Susan, all your native perennials, bringing in pollinators and beneficial insects all around your garden. You could do an espalier fruit tree, which means you're growing a fruit tree on a wall, like pruning it on a fence line. And so I'll include a list of all of my favorite plants that I would definitely look at including in the edible perennial border. This is something I'm always working on expanding and evolving as I build out and work on this garden.
If you want to break free from the industrial food system and make a real impact by growing your own regenerative garden, join the free Radical Gardening community on School. It's a safe place for like-minded growers, hundreds of members sharing, learning, and connecting. Inside, you'll also find a classroom, a members map with people all over the world, and a calendar of events. There's no algorithm, there's no ads, just a regenerative gardening community supporting each other, exactly how social media should be. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description. I'll see you in the community.
So the action steps for this lesson, before the next lesson, look at your garden plan, look out into your garden, Is every single bed a single crop, or do you have diversity already built in? Put at least one flowering plant to each bed in your plan. It could be on the end, it could be any of those plants that we mentioned. Identify one bed where you could create a simple layered planting, one tall crop, one medium crop, and one lower ground cover, and share an updated planting plan or an updated vision for your garden, something that you're working on, into the community. If it's a picture, great. Even a sketch showing where you've added diversity tells the story. And I'll see you in the next lesson.